What I would say is we're saying whether they're entering, how they're entering, they're all in it, just in different capacities. But it's also a necessity, right? So they have to explore alternatives because their existing product is declining and has been for decades.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields. With me, as always, is Kellen Finney. And this week, we got a very special guest, Nick Kenney, Global Strategic Advisor. Nick, thanks for taking the time. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Brian. How about yourself?
Doing well. Kellen, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Excited to talk to Nick today. How are you doing, Brian?
Yeah, I'm stoked. We're going to get some tobacco insights, maybe some alcohol insights, maybe some hot takes, maybe some Elon Musk. I'm not really sure where this conversation will go. So Nick, for our listeners, I'm familiar about you. Can you give a quick background on yourself and how you find your way to the cannabis space?
Yeah, I find it difficult to be quick, but I'll certainly give you a good cover. So my background is I started in working for a British tobacco company, not BAT, but the other one, in 2010. I moved to the US quickly afterwards and worked for their US entity. I got to the role of director of marketing for their US portfolio. But in 2015, funny enough, the president of the company walked into my office one day, shut the door and asked me one simple question, which kind of pivoted my whole life, which is, what do you know about cannabis? At that point, nothing apart from, consumption on occasion, although I shouldn't probably admit that. But and then for the next 3 weeks, it was a discussion on what does this look like? And then I completely left the business and moved into looking into and exploring the cannabis industry at that time, so 2016, and whether there was potential for a publicly listed entity to move into this environment. The next year and a half, essentially, I explored the global environment from state by state in the US to Canada, Germany, what different markets were doing. I moved out to California, my argument being that I needed to be in a legal market to see the relevance of it. And then I kind of shifted did a few additional projects outside of that in marketing for the business. But then 2019, I left that company, moved back to the UK and started my own consultancy, which was the very simple idea that a lot of established big corporations would be diversifying their interest, whether it's tobacco, alcohol, pharma, into nascent, highly regulated businesses and industries. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 6 years. I've worked for some very interesting companies, done some very interesting projects. But in essence, my platform is building commercial strategies and exploring opportunities for highly regulated and large organizations, diversifying to highly regulated but very infant, mature industries.
Was there a single data point or something specifically during your journey early on when you were researching it that was a signal to yourself that, hey, not only is there something here, there might be something major that made you believe that all these big major conglomerates would likely diversify into the industry?
Yeah, so I can give you two stories. The first one is simple. I went to MJ Biz in 2016 and it was in the Rio, right? 5,000 people. And I'd say the ratio of proponents who were, legacy proponents, people who had been in the industry for a long time, very authentic, was about 80% of the population of that conference. And 20% were VCs, investors exploring the space. I went to then the following year, the MJ Biz moved to the convention center. It went from 5,000 to 20,000 and the population shifted, completely switched. So 80% VCs, investors, 20% authentics. So then I saw, look, there's significant opportunity in establishing and there's significant interest that, that this could be an industry that's going to be around for a while and certainly stabilize. The second was I was with some very senior people and we did a tour of a number of markets. And when I remember going to Denver in 2017, and finding a dispensary in between a bakery and I think it was a children's clothes shop at the time. And how normalized the industry had become within a very quick time frame. To me, those were two indicators of, okay, at least, I can see the future. I can see the vision, which is essentially the normalization of the plant. And that to me was really where I was like, okay, they're onto something here. There's certainly potential here, and it's just a matter of finding the right path to navigate.
The finding the right path to navigate is the complex piece of the puzzle, right? Because this industry, as you've likely figured out during your time there, kind of operates a little uniquely, right? There's all these different regulations that sure some could apply from the more mature regulated industries like alcohol and tobacco. And there's other nuance aspects that make it a little more complex and unique. Hemp and cannabis would be the one I would point to. So in your opinion, then fast forwarding to today, how do outside industries look at this industry? Is your thesis still the same? Like, take us through that maturation process of thinking through like what you thought early on and where we are today and how the industry's evolved.
Well, so first and foremost, most businesses look for stabilization, right? Look for the ability to enter into a market that's stable, so that they have the money to acquire or enter and be significant in that place. But when it's regulatory immature, or when it's, gray, then it's very difficult to enter and stabilize market share, because you just don't know when the rug's being pulled or if it's going to be pulled. And so I'll take an account. If you're a UK entity, especially for the first 6 or 7 years, POCA is a huge issue, Proceeds of Crime Act. If you're listed, then you've got to consider so many considerations. You've got to consider your shareholder agreements. You've got to consider your banking, your insurance, just to even put the place in any shape or form. There are two entry points. There are two entry points. Firstly, if I'm a big company, I'm looking at what's the easiest pathway to enter. And it's probably the lower risk model, which is something that would be API related, or CBD, which is kind of, you've got components which are stabilization. Certainly in today, medical cannabis is a more stable marketplace in most countries globally, so you can operate across continents. So that would be as the lower risk entry point for most mature markets. Now, if your appetite is for more CPG related, and if you're a CPG company and you're looking at CPG opportunities, then of course you're going state to state in the US, or you're going at a more stable environment like Canada, albeit very restricted. So there are lots of variables, and it's you have to take each company and each investment appetite as a consideration. Every company's got different risk models. Every company's got different aspirations, and when I look at certainly the key players in tobacco, they've all kind of focused on different things, and that's one, it fits their models and their businesses, and also the strings that are being pulled behind the scenes. But also two, the one consistency throughout is they look at markets that are stabilized. So none, apart from potentially Altria, which is already US based, have really entered the US space. So that's pretty much the thought process at a high level.
When we talk stabilization, though, one would probably argue that this industry is far from stable, right? They've got infrastructure that is kind of confined in individual states, where I'd imagine if a tobacco company wants to operate in the space, they have large scale resources that are used to economies of scale. Spinning up infrastructure in New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware would seem ludicrous to them. And that's kind of how the industry currently operates here. So in one regard, if I was in their position, I'd think to myself, well, I'd want to see these companies kind of shutter their doors or really struggle down, because the way the industry is currently set up is not conducive for long-term economies of scale. So I wonder sometimes, as a tobacco company, if they're hoping that these companies struggle to the point of failure, where maybe future regulations can say, you know what, we made a mistake. That's not how things should work. We should open it up to more normalized regulations, kind of like how the tobacco industry works.
Yeah. So, all right. First step back, you're thinking very US centric, right? So tobacco companies often are global, right? So they look at global markets. And many of them not US based. So when you think about other markets like Germany or Switzerland, Australia, Canada, there are more stable frameworks out there that companies can, certainly from an R&D perspective, establish. They also look at, tobacco tends to be, yes, you've got combustibles, but then they're focused on more like synergistic industries. So vapor, as an example, like oral devices, pouches, things that can be infused, or things that are adjacencies that aren't plant touching. are exploration points for them, because they can be, applied to medical and then switch to adult use when it becomes more stable in a market like the US when it becomes bigger. So in terms of stabilization, there are stable markets out there that have built frameworks where it's a clearer point of entry. We're still at early stage, right? The level of investment that we're talking about, the tobacco companies, that may seem big, is still rather minor, and is very much R&D, exploration, building IP, doing the background behind learning about the plant, doing the background behind trying to build the right device that will work and put it in a medical context. And they just let the US do what it's doing. And until it becomes a more stable environment federally, then they won't touch it. Now, alcohol, it's a bit different, because one, if you're a US based alcohol company, then you're very interested in what's happening because of what's happening on hemp bev. But also, there is a component there which you've got a degree of control, right? So they're lobbying currently, as you see, you've got distributors versus companies at the moment combating at the federal level for lobbying power because of what's potentially down the line and what's at stake. You've got distributors who want it because they need the business, and you've got alcohol companies that don't want it because it's stealing share, arguably. So, at the end of the day, in that realm, without getting into too deep there, because your question was not related to that, the consumer is going to decide, right? The consumer at the end of the day is going to choose their consumption pattern and their behavior if it's federally stable, which is a big question mark, right? But in terms of tobacco, it's very much more of a global question, not a US-centric question.
So from stability, we're just talking regulations, right? Like sales seems stable, quote unquote, right? It depends on like what company's actually getting the sale, but people continue to purchase the product. So until there's like harmonization in America, you don't think that anyone's going to like make the same comparisons from just because the regulations change, and that's where the lack of stability comes. It's not from the lack of revenue being generated.
Well, look, if it was purely a commercial decision, then I'm sure companies would have entered years ago, right? The regulatory instability. Obviously, there's federal factors, right? You can't go to like one, so they can't be, they can't maximize their infrastructures. So they have a national infrastructure. They're not used to operating state by state. So therefore, it could also bleed into their banking structure and their banking charters, insurance, all those components that are going to be restrictive for an entity on a national level. And they're not used to. Now, they can do pilot testing state by state, and, that could be of interest, and that could well be, by the way, whether we believe it or not, tobacco, alcohol, these big companies are in this space. They're just not telling us about it.
They are.
So, some have told us about it, others aren't going to tell you about it, but there's an R&D house somewhere sitting in, that's a third party where they've got tons of learning, building data, and that's being seeped into the big parents. So what I would say is we're saying whether they're entering, how they're entering, they're all in it, just in different capacities. But it's also a necessity, right? So they have to explore alternatives because their existing product is declining and has been for decades. So, the first tranche of exploration for a tobacco company is an example, and alcohol is now experiencing it. But for tobacco combustibles are declining, right? Cigarettes are declining. So they have to, what's the next step? And for them, late 2000s was vapor devices, inhalation devices that are e-cigarettes or whatever. Then it was IQOS to reduce harm. Now it's looking at pouches, oral delivery systems that have the efficacy, and then comparables. And then when you cease nicotine, then what's next? And that's where cannabis comes in. It's a natural synergistic product profile. And in many countries, it's legal to research it. So why not do that and build a platform of data and R&D and IP that when more markets become stable, they can roll out, either acquire, which they could do, or do it themselves. But what's preventing them from the US right now? Very much the federal model, regulatorily on the federal level.
I love that you called out that everyone is operating here, because I think that's so important for people to remember, is that just because they're not flying the flag outside of their building doesn't mean that they're not here operating from an R&D standpoint, trying to figure out how to improve, because exactly like you laid out, when they're modeling out their business, they're understanding that If their portfolio is decreasing because consumers moving a different direction, they need to figure out how to invest to grow sales or grow revenue because that's their fundamental focus. And if this is a natural entry point, given everything we've laid out, it'd be silly for them not to at least invest some resources today in order to figure it out. But the things that I do want to call out that I think people might miss is the long-term approach that they're taking, right? The amount of money and resources that they have at their disposal to take that long-term approach and figuring out if we can have the data around the efficacy and understand exactly what we're doing, we can take such a different approach than I think a lot of the cannabis industries are understanding now, which is like, we have to figure out how to continue on, keep the lights on, keep it moving, which makes this industry kind of unique in that framework where everyone that's currently operating in it on a day-to-day standpoint is really short-term minded. And the tobacco industry is taking more of a long-term approach. So do you envision something that's having both those trajectories kind of colliding, or seems unlikely at the current moment?
So they're currently leveraging expertise in the space to build their frameworks for future entry, right? And to your point, they're spending a lot more doing so as stage gated to build the infrastructure. You know, BAT openly, they've got Sanity Group in Germany. They've got Organogram in Canada with Jupiter, which is their, you know, kind of their tool in the US to kind of figure things out. But they're building the expertise and building the IP to leverage at a future date. Do I see short-term survival of those companies that are building, and long-term? It will get closer over time because the markets are mature. I mean, I think, you know, we see it in data. Flowers becoming a decreasing product where finished dose products and dose products are becoming more applicable to the market. The consumer's making that decision. If you think about a consumer and the more they enter into it, their consumer behavior is, what do? They eat, they drink, they take pills. Not everyone smokes. Not everyone takes tinctures. They put cosmetics on. So those are the things they're used to. And that's what they're leaning towards as it becomes accessible to them. What we haven't seen, which is tobacco, which is what they'll be developing, is standardized, you know, consistent standardized products that of high quality. That's what's necessary for the future of the industry. Whether it's medical, whether it's adult use, when you buy something, you want to buy it the same every day. If you're going to consume it every day, you want the same product every day, same experience. And right now, we're certainly getting there within the industry, and the more mature players are certainly standardized. But we're talking about high production standards, high quality standards in terms of understanding the efficacy. You know, it's not just taking it, what it does to the human system, you know, what it does to those CB1, CB2 receptors, how the body integrates it, how we measure levels of efficacy. These are all the exploration paths that are going down. Do I think that cannabis companies are doing that right now? I don't think so. But I don't know. I don't blame them either. Like, you know, they're in markets where they have to survive and they've got taxes and operate state by state. Like, they don't have the time to focus. And if they do, great on them. But, you know, that's where future capital is going to come into it, is having a consistent model that can be national with a national entry.
Couldn't they be doing a lot of that like in the hemp space though? And it could translate to both the cannabis and hemp space because there's just so many similarities and there's a giant like D9 delta, you know, D9 issue in the hemp space as well right now. But, you know, they don't have the same like handcuffs, if you will.
True. But let's think about this fairly. You know, that market is 2-3 years old. It's been a race to market, race to shelf, race to build a portfolio of offerings that consumers will be enticed by. You know, I would argue that most don't quite know, you know, the data is slim on it, right? So I don't think that most know what the perfect milligram is for that market. And also state by state, the market and the threshold's moving from a milligram perspective. So do we think it will go there? For sure. But I mean, we're 2-3 years in. We haven't got mass exposure yet, you know, and where hemp beverage is strong is in the fact that they can have product in main store retail, but they're not even there yet. You know, we've got the pilot test for Target and all those kind of things, but we haven't even delved deep into what this potential could be. So do I think they're thinking about measured data and efficacy? Do I think they're thinking about combinations of cannabinoids and what the delivery mechanism will be and what the effects will be on the human body? And probably not at this time. It's too early. It's just a rush to shelf right now.
Could it be though that like these ingredients are essentially like like sugar, right? Like humans ate sugar forever. People didn't get sick from it. Okay, yeah, there's some issues potentially with health, right? But like, like Coca-Cola was around forever before they started studying like the effects of sugar on the human like system, right? So like, could it potentially end up becoming something like that where like, it's just another random ingredient that people are consuming without like, clearly they're not dying after they drink the beverage. You know what I mean? Like,
here's the thing. What you don't have in that environment, in that example specifically, is the legacy of the product.
Yeah.
Right. So cannabis has this hundreds of years of legacy with it, carrying with it, where people already have an opinion of the plant before they consume it. And they already have, whether it's negative or positive, they'll have an opinion of that beverage before you even drink it. So I think that's the difference. It will be, we almost have to go ahead and study the effects, understand what the product is before we bring a product to market in a true national format, because that's the concern, right? The reason why this is on a federal level being considered to be banned is because people are worried of what happens when someone drinks it and that there are no standards in place. So, that's the same conversation that, big companies are having. I can tell you one of the biggest hurdles to bring in a big, with a publicly listed board is people's personal experiences of the plant. It wasn't the commercial. Everyone understood the commercial potential, everyone understood the opportunity. It was more so that someone's nephew or someone, had a negative experience with the plant, and therefore their opinion's somewhat tainted. And that's where we are in this space, is we've got to appreciate that people's exposure to cannabis could have been negative before we even bring any product to market. So we have to get over that barrier. And that's why whenever a company's bring something to market, we have to ensure it's safe and regular. That's why I'm in favor of, I don't think prohibition works. It never has. What works is regulation, effective, but also sensible regulation and sensible taxation. And, when in the tobacco industry, we always, thought about different countries in terms of, how sensible they were. Going one extreme way or another is not the way to address a highly regulated or potential harmful product. It's consumers already have access to it. All that benefits from a prohibition is the illicit market. So you've got to think sensibly about this, and that's where I think that we should be pushing towards.
Going kind of back to like the high level strategy, I was thinking through some of the things you had just shared. Do you think that the tobacco companies internally are thinking about it as like an arms race, willing, well, BAT is investing X, we also need to invest X in order to try to meet them? Because what you were saying with the investment standpoint of going through the process and trying to figure all those things out, those things take time. And that involves resources, and you need to be positioning people there from a strategic standpoint. And if you're just going to wait around and see, sometimes that doesn't pertain to the first mover advantage. Do you think there could be kind of like an arms race from a hidden side where the tobacco companies all know, okay, company X is doing this, we have to at least do this, or it's kind of not like that?
No, I do think to some extent it is like that. And again, it depends what pressures they're getting from their board, from their shareholders. Certainly in the beginning stages of cannabis, there was a lot of questions related to, in most of the companies were being asked questions about what, are you thinking about cannabis? Are you exploring cannabis? Because that's naturally, they have to diversify, and why aren't you doing into a potential seismic industry? So in terms of competing against each other, yeah, there are certain elements that will be looking at each other, like the likes of BAT and PMI, I'm sure are looking at each other and trying to beat each other. BAT's taken one model, PMI's taking a very different model. And so there are others that just focus on their own business, right? And, Imperial being one, they made an initial investment. They've now got a completely different board. They've got a completely different senior exec, and their focus has been tobacco first. And, let's do what we do best, and let's, seek the optimization of our existing portfolio before we go and explore anything further. There are others that have had restrictions in the past on where they're based, where they're domiciled, so they haven't been able to explore this to any significant extent. Those things are changing, I think, in Asian markets. Certain tobacco companies out there, but I do think at some point when it becomes more centralized in terms of federal regulation in the US, and it becomes a clearer path, then I think there'll be certainly who's ready to go. And I think it will be a competition at that point. I think for now, most are just exploring the R&D and making small bets on different investments for the time being. But I think it will be in place at a certain point, but not right now.
What about the technology, right? Like I know that like tobacco invests a ton of money in R&D for vape technology, for like bioavailability. Are they looking to maybe like even like license some of that technology portfolio into the space as a way to like be in the space, have exposure, but not like be a plant touching business? Is that kind of some of the strategies that are currently like being deployed right now?
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's a great question. And to address that, they absolutely have been investing heavily in that space. And it makes sense, right? They're experts they've got the infrastructure to support it. They understand it. Will they license? I don't know. I would think it makes sense in some realm, but there's an element there, which is why would they need to? They can do it in certain markets, test it through third parties, but still retain control rather than license it out. I think most companies would look to control it from the outset, and they're of the size they can be patient. So I don't think they'd license it. I think they're more likely to be on the hunt and acquire what's already out there and then bring it internal, which they've done before. I don't think they'd license their tech at this point. And also, who would they license it to?
Yeah, who's got money?
Well, they're looking for the funding and capital from these guys. They're not looking to these guys.
Well, they could also spin up a shell company pretty easily, right? And they can put that out there and say, we're going to test this out. And I think, to your point, Nick, about figuring out they're on the hunt for acquiring the assets. And the reason I ask those questions is because, like, given your relationship in the space and the understanding of the dynamic, I'm sure they're like, hey, Nick, like, we're hearing X in the space. Should we be considering doubling down and Y? Where it's really difficult because exactly like you said, it's like there's this balance of risk mitigation and saying, okay, we want to feel comfortable, but you also need to invest, but you also need to be ready. It's kind of like this really unique dichotomy of figuring out how much resources to put forward where there isn't really a perfect answer.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's in the realm of what they'd have to invest. It's quite not easy, but it's the potential is out there. So in terms of risk reward, right? The risk obviously is capital outlay to invest in this industry when there's not immediate revenue to return. So it's all R&D centric at the moment, testing. So it's all a cost, and the revenue we're not receiving because we're planning for a longer term play. But when you've got billions and billions of dollars in the bank, it's very easy to then commit $100 million to something at this time, right? So there is certainly a balance and there'll be those internal conversations. But I think, they'll have spent a lot of time working out what's our comfortability level of investment. And then what do we need to do in the short term to keep up the momentum and also report to our shareholders that we've had some return on this investment in the short term, whether that's developing a pouch, whether it's developing some form of oral delivery system that can be sold in the CBD market as a medical device. Those investment plans, and again, for companies that have had to pay millions upon millions for instance, in the US PMTA on the tobacco side, then this is an attainable cost. They can eat it.
Sure, no doubt about it. But kind of thinking through it, like first mover advantage doesn't seem like it really applies here.
No. In what sense? Because first mover, when it becomes federal, will be important because at that point it's a race to market, right? Because once there becomes a stable platform from everyone has the same playbook, same platform to build from, then it's really about shelf space. It's about getting consumer attention into your product portfolio. It's about getting national distribution. And they already have the infrastructure to plug and play. In the meantime, yeah, they can bide their time, and it's not there's not a first mover advantage in any shape or form.
And given their political influence, one could argue that they would have a good grasp on if federally would move in that direction.
I think you're giving too much credit politics that doesn't make sense. So yeah, you're right. They have lobbying influence, not necessarily in the cannabis world. So obviously different bodies are looking after different things. If it's from an FDA standpoint, absolutely. If it's built into the frameworks that they're used to, then yes. If it's outside of that, then they have to obviously invest in that to have lobbying power. But yeah, you're right. They have influence, they have exposure, they have understanding. Certainly at this point. They didn't many years ago, but they do now.
Is there any strategies that current cannabis companies can learn from, let's call it alcohol or tobacco, things that they experience throughout their growth periods where, okay, this is what we understand today, the industry operates one way, but we need to have an eye in saying, okay, we have to invest resources over here. Is there anything that they can pull from previous experiences in order to, have a forward-looking approach?
Yeah. So look, there was no innovation for tobacco for decades, right? So until it was pressed upon them and still cigarettes started to decline, there was no need for innovation. I think the only difference was the size of the cigarette. So they got complacent and they started diversifying. A number of them had diversified outside of the industry. So they started going, some bought hotel groups. So diversification has always been a tactic, but it's been kind of not within their industry or adjacency. Then they started to innovate and diversify in the early 2000s. And for that, they realized two things. One, we're not very good at it. And two, we have to play to our strengths. There's no point going and buying a hotel booth in a golf resort when we don't know anything about hoteliers, hospitality. So what you're seeing and what they're doing is playing to adjacencies. And that's investment is, okay, what is this? What are the synergistic? We know inhalation, we know bioavailability, we understand the consumer. So let's start investing in the same with alcohol. We understand behaviors, we understand experiences. We have a Sensidium model of effects and behaviors, and we can play to that. And then how do we build in that model into our existing business and start investing in those adjacencies in other industries? And so that's what they're doing. They're investing in inhalation devices. They're investing in understanding oral delivery systems and mechanisms outside of what they already have. And they're also investing in understanding the plant. Because, tobacco is quite simple. Cannabis is very complicated. So that's a lot of upskilling they have to do. It's not just one, it's not just nicotine. You've got you've got 140 cannabinoids that we are aware of. So yeah, I think the learning curve is quite steep for them, but they've been on this journey and they're certainly investing to understand it.
And that's where on the flip side, the cannabis operators, they're doing extraction, they're doing cultivation, they're doing distribution, they're doing retail. There's a lot of different moving pieces. Like from your perspective, if one of them came to you and said, hey, Nick, we're trying to figure out how to be in front of this, should we double down on one area? Should we figure out what we do well in? Because, being average at everything means you're okay at some stuff and not great at any.
Yeah, look, I think first of all, it really depends on their situation. So in a state where it has to be vertically integrated, they don't have a choice, right? And in others, it's always better to be good at one thing than average at everything. What I would say is, and this has been used on because many companies obviously on the flip side have come to me saying, I want to get investment, I'm looking for an investor. And, there's kind of almost 4 or 5 things that they have to review of their own organization to see if there's if there's any point getting an investor involved. Fundamentally, they have to have a good strategy, a commercial way to win. They have to have a credible management team. But really, when it comes to your point on what should they focus on, what's their point of differentiation? So are they a specialist or a generalist? And do they have a point of differentiation that is it protected? Is it not? So do they have some IP, or is it just a good business model? Because if it's just a good business, then it comes down to, have they developed a brand to protect it? So are they building something that, if nothing's special about their ingredients, then is the brand the special thing? Is the brand, they're building awareness. And so that company would come in and invest because it's a good and well-known brand and the brand means something. Otherwise, if they're just a generic operation that has nothing, unique or a point of difference that's protected, it's not really going to be that interest because the reality is there are others out there that are doing it. So if you're looking at your business and you're saying, okay, we've got a goodness, then maybe that's just what you are. Or if you're looking for outside investment from a big player or from an investor, then it might be good to double down in a specialist area. And so what are we really good at? And let's specialize and let's focus on that, because then that's what we'll become known for.
I think that point is so important. And I think given the speed at which these infrastructures has been spun up in so many different areas, that companies have not really figured out which specific vertical we do really well. And I think, what got you here today is likely what's not going to get you to the next level. And I think you laid it out exactly why it won't.
Yeah. We're often talk about, obviously in my world, my background being tobacco, would think about big businesses. But one thing that, big corporations focus heavily on is the consumer. Right. And the reality is consumers don't think in categories anymore. They think in outcomes and experiences. They don't look at a category. They look at, well, how's it going to make me feel? How do I incorporate into daily life? I'm looking for that end outcome. I'm not necessarily looking, because we look at it from beverage and they're looking for, they need a drink and that's their social experience of it. Those big corporations really look at what consumers are leaning towards. So if you're a company and if you don't have anything unique about your business, my recommendation would be, and if you don't want to be a specialist, my recommend would be understand the consumer and build that data pool. Because data, and you guys know more than anyone, is so conflicting in this industry and is so, in every sense, bad, that if you've got good data, you've got good understanding of the consumer, then, if nothing else, that's something that's of value. And so that's an area of focus that I would go on if I don't want to be double down as a formulator or double down as a retailer or whatever. I'd build that brand or I'd build that consumer knowledge.
Data is only as valuable though as the actions you make on it.
Yeah.
Hoarding the data just to hoard the data provides no benefit for anyone.
No, but certainly I'm not saying that you build the data just to sit on it. But then that data is of value, right? So you can, yes, certainly you act upon it and build the data and then go and use those insights to go and leverage it. But also, that data, and if you've got a consumer database of understanding of the behaviors, the purchase patterns, all that kind of stuff, that's something you can sell. That's something you can leverage. You can sell either to a data provider or you can sell to competitors, or you can, that's why I'm building. You're building an asset of value, and then how you leverage that is up to you.
Perfectly said. I think the point of that was that the answers are there. You just have to be able to figure out, okay, we need to now spend time and effort going through the data and figuring out how are we going to leverage this? Because exactly like you said, it's an asset that's sitting there waiting, but it needs to be utilized in the capacity so that you can benefit from the acquiring of the data.
Very well said.
Last question for you. What question do you wish more people asked you?
It's a very good question. I would say that it's not a cop-out, just so you know. I think the best or most greatest asset and valuable asset of our industry, especially a fledgling industry, is the people you meet and the network you build. And so whether it's a client or anyone, I would love them to ask me, who do I not know that I should? Because I think the knowledge in this industry is second to none, and the community that's being built is second to none. And so I really feel that we should be reaching out as much as possible, having connections, having conversations, learning what others are doing. And so that would be the question I would hope people would ask is, who do you think I should meet in this industry, or who do I not know that I should? And then go from there.
I love it. Nick, for our listeners, they want to get in touch, they want to learn more, where can they find you?
If they really want to meet, LinkedIn, I'm there, Nick Kenney. I mean, if you Google Nick Kenney Cannabis or Nick Kenney Tobacco, I'm sure I'll show up. I have a website, kbsstrategicadvisors.com. And obviously an email at nick.kenney@kbs-consultancy.com. And, I stupidly didn't think of shorter versions. It would have been much more helpful. But yeah, happy to connect with everyone. I'm a big believer in, getting to meet, having those 30-minute conversations. I tend to drone on, as you probably experienced. So if you want more succinct conversation, I can do that too.
I love it. Thanks for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.